The war between Ukraine and Russia changed the basic balances in the world militarily, socio-economically, and politically as the tension in the war reached its peak. The conflict zones affected by the war also flared up, while the countries of the world were going through a process of disintegration due to the Ukraine-Russian war. It was inevitable for Moscow to exhaust its military and political volume. Over time, the effects of the war also changed the global balances in the Middle East. Iran's support for Russia's aim of turning the Middle East into its own farm in order to raise front forces has mobilized Israel, which has a say in this region. Israel continues to be sharply opposed to Russia's use of Iran and its Iranian-backed militant forces in Syria to reshape the playing field. Recently, Israel's military and financial support to Ukraine has caused a serious crisis between Russia and Israel in Syria. Israel, which did not remain silent about Russia's purchase of kamikaze drones from Iran, pressed the button to disrupt this game in Syria and to support Ukraine on the front lines in response to Russian and Iranian cooperation. Israel provided the Ukrainian army with the necessary details and crucial intelligence data on drones. There are even allegations that some Israeli defense companies are providing advanced anti-drone warfare systems to Ukraine via Poland. The Israeli administration did not undertake such a shipment, but announced that it would not intervene in the situation since it was made through a private company. Currently, Ukraine has even been able to carry airstrikes to Russian territory thanks to these data provided by Israel. Israel, which wants to prevent Russia and Iran from cooperating with Ukraine, which is fighting for the freedom war in the Middle East, launched an attack on the Damascus airport in Syria the other day. These attacks, which aimed to destroy Iranian-related targets and Russian resources at the airport, were a heavy blow to the Moscow and Tehran administrations. While Russia targeted the civilian infrastructures of Ukraine with Iranian-made UAVs, Israel's F-16 fighter jets reportedly bombed the military airport with at least 8 missiles. It is seen that Israeli jets carried out a successful operation at midnight by surpassing the Russian-made air defense systems in Syria and even the S-300 air defense systems that Russia gave to Iran. Satellite images showed that one runway at Damascus airport was hit by multiple missiles while the other was hit by only one missile. 2 Iranian-backed militant group members were killed and 3 were injured in airstrikes targeting Israel's Damascus International Airport. It has been announced that material damage also occurred at the Damascus airport in the Israeli attacks and that the main international airport in the capital was temporarily taken out of service due to the damage. Satellite images also revealed a remarkable detail during Israeli airstrikes. It was understood that generally relatively large weapons were smuggled through this airport by Iranian cargo lines, which frequently landed at Damascus International Antias, or for air base outside the city of Palmyra in central Syria. In the frames reflected in the satellite images, the change in the military resources of Iran and Russia over time and the differences after the attacks summarized the situation better. It was claimed that some of the Iranian and Russian warplanes and other military resources disappeared at Damascus airport before the Israeli airstrikes. It was also reported that an Iranian cargo plane had launched at Damascus airport during the attack. The damage or explosion of some Iranian military resources at the airport further aggravated the relations between Israel and the Russian-Iranian alliance. Syrian regional intelligence sources reported that Israeli airstrikes also targeted outposts controlled by Iranian-linked militias. It is known that the shower of air-launched missiles by Israeli fighter jets destroyed the Iranian-backed militia post, as well as targets south of Damascus. The Israeli Air Force has previously targeted this airport. In recent weeks, entry and exit from Damascus International Airport has been suspended for 2 weeks after alleged Tel Aviv jets caused extensive damage to infrastructure, including a runway and a terminal. Tehran-based media channels also reported that IRGC or Hezbollah soldiers and their positions were under fire. There is a different power union in Syria. A substantial portion of the Syrian army consists of Iranian-backed militias or IRGC soldiers and commanders. In addition, Russia has a very serious military presence in the region. In this case, it is stated that the open alliance of Iran and Russia in Syria or serving similar purposes goes against Israel's regional and national interests. In addition to the Damascus airport, Israel has also allegedly hit Aleppo International Airport in recent months. But Tel Aviv denies most of these attacks. Western and regional intelligence sources revealed that Tehran is adopting civilian air transport as a more reliable means of delivering military equipment to its forces and militants in Syria after Israel allegedly interrupted its ground supply. Both the Iranian administration and Russia are quite hesitant about Israel supporting Ukraine and destroying the sources of cooperation between Moscow and Tehran in Syria. On the other hand, especially the Tehran administration is very afraid that Israel would target strategic air bases such as Damascus or Aleppo again. It has claimed that especially Iran's military resources are concentrated in Aleppo. The damage or destruction of some of Russia's military equipment at the Damascus airport brought the global tension in the war to the last point. But Israel's courage is determined not to give a voice to this alliance. Tel Aviv signaled that it would change the balance in Syria during the period when non-war civilian attacks against Ukraine continued. As a rule, the Israeli military does not comment on specific attacks in Syria, but acknowledges that it had conducted hundreds of sorties against Iranian-backed groups trying to gain a foothold in the country and Russian military forces in that region. And Israel, by continuing these attacks, is trying to accelerate the building of an environment of trust in the Middle East. Israel, as the only state that opposes Russia and Iran's interest-based Middle East project, is making moves to the advantage of Ukraine, while Russia is trying to train some of its military units in Syria, and the possibility that these units can be used in the Ukraine war in the necessary time periods. The situation is much more complicated. While Israel's reassuring approach to Ukraine at least provides a little more peace in the region after Israel launched attacks on Iranian and Russian targets in Syria to support the Ukrainian government, Tehran and Moscow administrations also began to take precautions against air strikes in Syria. Syria and Iran have deployed new air defense systems, including jamming and early warning systems around Damascus to prevent Israeli air strikes in the region. There are reports that the new systems are being built by Korean and Chinese companies and supplied by Iran under agreements reached between Damascus and Tehran. It was also noted last week that Iran is trying to rekindle the expansion of its presence near Damascus, which it has always tried to do, but has previously been blocked by Russia. Tehran's goal is to create another southern suburb in Syria, commonly known as Dai, like the Hezbollah-dominated suburb of Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. Now, with Israel's direct intervention in the game, the landscape in the Middle East has changed. Russia seems to need allies to invade Ukraine. Therefore, Iran, which provides unmanned aerial vehicles and missiles to Moscow to be used against the Ukrainians, is evacuating the region due to threats of Israel. Tensions peaked in the Ukrainian city of Kiev amid Russia's missile attack on Ukraine on the last day of December when Moscow and Tehran stirred up again. Authorities also announced that Iranian-made Russian UAVs targeted infrastructure in and around the Ukrainian capital, damaging power facilities and causing some power outages. The Ukrainian Air Force reported that its air defense systems deployed all of Russia's 39 Iranian-made Shahed UAVs targeting Ukraine overnight, describing it as a major attack. Kiev Governor Alexei Kuleba stated that the Russians launched several waves of Shahed drones and targeted critical infrastructure facilities. But Kuleba added that the air defense in Ukraine is at work. Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko announced that 40 drones were on their way to Kiev overnight. Klitschko also noted that of the 22 drones over Kiev, 3 were destroyed in the remote region of Kiev and 15 in neighboring provinces. We will see together whether the advantage that Israel has provided to the Kiev government, which has destroyed the cooperation established by Iran and Russia for the Ukraine war, will continue in the later stages of the war, and which other countries will be involved in this game. Let's hope Tel Aviv is not alone in this while supporting Ukraine. The Russian army is experiencing something it never expected in Ukraine. Russia thought it could easily invade Ukraine, but the Ukrainian army is showing a historic resistance. Russia is suffering one of the worst defeats in history. Due to the defeat, Russian soldiers started to surrender. The surrender of Russian soldiers seems to be a major change in the course of the war. What is the reason for the surrender of Russian soldiers? Before deciding to go to war, the Russian army considered itself the most powerful army in the world. Russia, which underestimated Ukraine, is now in a pitiful state. The most important reason why Russia is in this situation is the successes of the Ukrainian army. One by one, Ukraine is thwarting Russia's plans and is being praised for its historic resistance. But is Ukraine's success a sufficient reason for Russian troops to surrender? To answer this question, we need to go to the field. Let's look for the answer on the battlefield together. There are 3 regions in Ukraine currently occupied by Russia. These regions are Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia. Ukraine has managed to liberate more than half of the occupied territories by making the right and strategic moves. Ukraine is gaining the upper hand in the war. Russia's plans do not seem to have been given much thought thanks to Ukraine's operations. 105,960 military personnel have been killed so far. The war has been going on for 311 days. Russian soldiers are aware of their losses. Feeling defeated, Russian soldiers want to surrender. The Ukrainian army has psychological superiority over the Russian soldiers. Hundreds of soldiers are dying every day, which scares Russian soldiers who do not want to die. Surrender? In some occupied areas, Russian soldiers started waving white flags when they saw the Ukrainian army. It is known that Russian soldiers do not want to fight. The footage of Russian soldiers surrendering without engaging in combat is being recorded and constantly shared by the Ukrainian army. The surrender of Russian soldiers causes a loss of reputation for the Russian army. The moments when Russian soldiers surrender are recorded by unmanned aerial vehicles. Images are shared on social media. Other Russian soldiers show the greatest interest in the shared images. Russian soldiers sent these videos to each other via Telegram and talk about the need to surrender. Russian soldiers are in a difficult situation because their needs are not met in the Russian army. But the soldiers who surrendered were received better than they expected in the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers make videos saying that the Ukrainian army treats them well and invite other soldiers to surrender. Russian soldiers say that the Ukrainian army has facilities that the Russian army does not have. Putin's treatment of Russian soldiers in his speeches and sanctions has led to an increase in surrenders. Zelensky is making moves to turn the situation in his favor. He appears in front of the press and calls on Russian soldiers to surrender, saying the positive thoughts of the surrendered Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers in the army want to surrender. Zelensky changed the course of the war with his moves. Zelensky addresses Russian soldiers as follows: "We are listening to what you are talking about among yourselves. We know that the war is pointless. We know that you are ashamed of your defeat, and we know what you think about your state. On behalf of the Ukrainian people, we offer you a choice: surrender, and we will treat you the way people deserve. As you were not treated in the Russian army the way your army does not treat our army. The choice is yours. There are many problems in the Russian army. These problems make Russian soldiers want to surrender. The Russian army has the largest number of military personnel in the world. It currently has over 1 million military personnel and 2 million reservists. Russia, which has a crowded army, cannot cope with the problems in the army. There are 22 different autonomous republics in the Russian Federation. Minority groups mostly live in certain regions. These minority groups are compulsorily recruited into the Russian army. But there is a great racism against these groups in the Russian army. Russian soldiers and Russian commanders subject minorities to terrible conditions. They send minorities to risky operations and do not care if they die. The Russian army has a tense environment for many reasons. Soldiers are surrendering to the Ukrainian army in their regions because of the bad behavior and conditions they are subjected to. They know that Putin and the Russian government don't care about them, and they don't want to fight for Russia. The majority of the Russian people do not support this war either. Anti-war people are organizing protests and demonstrations in the main squares of Russia. The anti-war and rebel soldiers are known to say this is Putin's war, not ours. It is thought that the reason for this war is that Putin does not want to leave his seat. Putin, who wants his political career to continue, does not want to admit that the war is going badly for Russia. The Russian army consists of mercenaries and conscripts. Mercenaries have many privileges within the army. This disturbs the Russian soldiers who are conscripted into the army. Compulsorily, mercenaries work under the Wagner Group. Mercenaries do not take part in risky operations and are paid much more than other soldiers. The director of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, is politically influential and mercenaries only listen to his orders. Mercenaries do not follow the orders of Russian commanders. Biden believes that the Wagner Group committed many violations of international law during the war. It is thought that the Biden government will classify the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization. As can be seen at the hierarchical order in the Russian army is broken. Russian generals, like the soldiers, do not want to fight anymore and resign. Inexperienced officers are taking the place of the resigned generals. This situation leads to further disorganization in the already broken Russian army. As the turmoil in the Russian army increases, Russian soldiers continue to surrender. Uncoordinated soldiers on the battlefield caused even more damage to the army. While the surrender of Russian soldiers is good for them, it also has important benefits for Ukraine. Russia wants its surrendered soldiers back. In return, Ukraine says it wants a prisoner swap. In this way, Ukraine gets back its soldiers captured by Russia at the beginning of the war. The Russian army was confident in its numbers and underestimated Ukraine. But now the Ukrainian army has an incredible superiority over Russia. Every day, Russian soldiers continue to surrender. If Russian soldiers continue to surrender at this rate, there will be no soldiers left in the Russian army to fight Ukraine. John Spencer, a retired U.S. general, made statements about the course of the Ukraine-Russia war. He stated that the war will end in summer of 2023 due to the losses of the Russian army and the surrender of Russian soldiers, stating that Putin's invasion of Ukraine failed. Spencer also said that no matter how unsuccessful the invasion was, Putin would not withdraw. But there is also a claim that the war can be slowed down by Putin. The retired general said Putin may slow it down to gain power because of the problems in his army and weapons. At this stage, increasing support for Ukraine will be one of the moves that will put Putin in a more difficult position. If Russia is left alone in this war, it is enough for it to lose the war. What do you think about the surrender of Russian soldiers? Do you think Zelensky's speeches were effective and the surrender of Russian soldiers? What do you think about the problems in the Russian army? What do you think the consequences of Putin's inability to prevent the problems in the Russian army? The big news is coming from the Luhansk region. Here, the Ukrainians managed to undermine Russian defense in one of the strongest fortifications on the Svatova line, cut supplies to the Slivka group, and finally forced the Russians out of this group of settlements. Such developments not only served as a great ending to the battle for the Kozlovka group, but also set conditions for further expansion because the Ukrainians effectively created a salient around the Russians in Volodymyrivka. Volodymyrivka will fall very soon as well. And here is why. First of all, When it comes to the Kozlovka group, last time the Ukrainians have broken through the primary defenses by assaulting Stepov, Novoselivka and Ivanivka. From here, tough fights have been taking place between Yagodny and Kozlovka as the Russians still had pretty strong positions. For the Ukrainians, attacking often meant getting caught in the crossfire because these settlements are located less than 1 kilometer from each other. So every attack was in direct view from multiple Russian-controlled settlements. If the Ukrainians attack Slivka, they are counted from Yagodny. If they attack Yardny, they are counted both from Kozlovka and Orlovskaya. That is why the Ukrainians slowly developed new tactics to storm Russian positions more effectively. Firstly, the Ukrainians conducted an attack on Nikolaevka. The attack was unexpected and the Russians even lost control over this village for some time. And this was enough. The Ukrainians created a lot of uncertainty in this region and also started attacking Orlansky. The main purpose of these attacks was to fix Russian positions and keep them busy, while the Ukrainians conducted their main attacks, and their main attacks were directed towards Yadin and Slivka. When it comes to Kotlyarovsky, there was a substantial decrease in the number of attacks. The main reason behind it was the fact that Kotlyarovsky is located on the highlands relative to Ukrainian positions in Tabuinka. If you look at the topographic map, we can see that Kotlyarovsky is around 40 meters above Tabuinka. We can also see that both Kozlovka and Yadin are located at the highlands as well, which gave the Russians a tactical advantage. However, after the Ukrainians captured Stepanova, Novoselivka and Ivanovka, attacking Kyselivka became much easier. Nonetheless, it was not a text that eventually pushed the Russians out of their positions. It was the lack of supplies. As you can see, there is basically only one road that the Russians could use to supply the Kozlovka group, and even though some parts of it are behind the hill, other parts are still in direct vision from Ivanovka. A logical question would be then, why did the Ukrainians attack them if they supposedly could just wait until the Russians ran out of supplies? There are two reasons. Firstly, some supplies still got through. Secondly, constant attacks made. The Russians spend their supplies at a faster rate, much faster than the new supplies were coming in. Russian retreat from Kozlovka did not attract a lot of media attention, which is why it was uncertain for some time about such developments. However, yesterday, when the Russian Ministry of Defense reported about shelling a Ukrainian command center located in Kozlovka, it became clear that the Ukrainians established total control over this region. The latest reports suggest that the Ukrainians are still trying to storm Yagodny, which proves to be difficult, and they also advanced towards Volodymyrivka, which proved to be successful. As you remember when we discussed the Kazivka area last time, I told you that the Ukrainians won the forest battle and established total control over the forest. The Ukrainians finished clearing the forest and had advanced a little bit northeast. As you can see, a simultaneous advance from Kotlyarovsky and the forest creates a salient around Volodymyrivka. If we look closer at Volodymyrivka, we can see that there are basically no roads in this region. There are only a few dirt roads that go through the fields, so supplying the soldiers that are holding the fence in this village is extremely difficult. On top of that, Volodymyrivka is located in the lowlands, so I do not expect the Russians to hold this position for a long time if the Ukrainians start storming this settlement. Overall, the Ukrainians managed to starve out the Russians in the Kozlovka group and got rid of some of the most fortified positions on their way to Svardov. This improved Ukrainian tactical positions substantially and set conditions for future advances toward Volodymyrivka.